The next session is a panel discussion on challenges for public retirement systems. We thought we would go from the US to our neighbor Canada, all the way over to Asia, because these kinds of problems are universal all over the world, and we have a number of interesting perspectives on these problems. I asked the panelists for solutions, but they told me it was easier to explain the problems than to solve them. So maybe we'll leave it to the audience to respond with the solutions. So going up first is Bob Pozen.
I guess I got to put this on.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I've been asked to talk about retiree health care plans, which is sort of like the elephant in the room. Just remembered when Detroit went bankrupt, the unfunded pension liability was in the area of $3.5 billion. The unfunded retiree health care was about $6 billion. So this is actually not atypical. These numbers in retiree health care have been neglected, and they are rising rapidly. What is it? It's that most of these jurisdictions allow people to retire at 45 or 50, and then they promise them free health care, either to Medicaid or for the rest of their lives. And that's an expensive promise. And let's see. Okay, and these are called OPEBs, for those of you not familiar with the jargon. And they're basically the premium subsidies for healthcare. Some of these premium subsidies are 100%, some of them are 80%, but they're pretty big. Now, one of the reasons why people haven't really focused on this until about 2006, there was no disclosure. This goes back to the speech that Jeremy made. There was literally no disclosure. And then finally, GASB got the courage to require some footnote disclosure, and so we were able to start to compute this. GASB just adopted a new set of rules, which takes several steps further. Most importantly, they've come up with a uniform discount rate. You can argue, I'm sure Debbie, other people would argue they have the wrong one, but at least they have one that's not 6 or 7%. Today's it's about 3.3%, and whether it's the right one or not, it's surely a step in the right direction. And then the other big deal is that it's requiring you to compute the unfunded liability and put it on your balance sheet as a city or a state. So that will be a big deal. Now, just to look at these charts quickly to see what levels we're talking about is, to me, what's interesting about this chart is how big the per capita numbers are in states like New York and New Jersey. I mean, New Jersey, $7,206 per person for retiree healthcare unfunded liability. That's a pretty huge number. But what's interesting is there are other states actually have done a pretty good job. So it's not like you can't do a good job. It's just that some do it and some don't. Cities, the same sort of thing, where you get New York leading the way. Boston is right up there. And just to give you, this sort of follows what Jeremy thinks. So Boston in 2009 reported this number, and now they're reporting one about $2 billion lower. Why? They changed their discount rate and expected return by 2%, and abracadabra, they reduced their unfunded liabilities. But again, we have cities that do a good job, and we have cities that do a bad job. Now, to me, one of the most important things that needs to be focused on by this group is that OPEBs are very different than pensions. In pensions, we have ERISA, and as we'll see, we have lots of state constitutional provisions. So there is no funding requirement for an OPEB. Even under the new rules, there's no funding requirement. There is an incentive in the sense that GASB says if you pre-fund, then you're allowed to reduce your liability. And my colleague Josh Rao at Stanford doesn't like the way they do that, but at least they're encouraging people to pre-fund. On the other hand, OPEBs are not protected by state constitutions the way pension liabilities are. And we've seen in places like California and Illinois, you virtually can't change anything, not even a cost of living adjustment. They're declared unconstitutional under state law. So what can we do about it? And I actually am going to say something about what we can do about it. Is the Supreme Court came out with a case which was a collective bargaining agreement in the private sector. It wasn't a well-known case, but it has some very important language in it, because it says this was a case where the union thought they had been promised free health care forever. And the company said, no, we can't give it to you forever. We have to have you contribute 50%. So the union sued them. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, actually said that the union would lose and the company would win. And in the process, they established two presumptive principles, which are really going to be critical and give people a tool going forward. One is that you don't get lifetime benefits outside of pensions, and they distinguish pensions as different, unless there's explicit language in the collective bargaining agreement that says these health benefits are for life. And if any of you have been involved with collective bargaining, you know these contracts are all over the place, and explicit, clear language isn't characteristic of it. And the other thing the court said is presumptively, whatever healthcare promises you make end when the collective bargaining agreement ends, which is usually anywhere from 3 to 10 years, and then you have to renegotiate. So this, to me, is the biggest tool, and I really have tried to talk to Dan to go in front of the cities and the states, is because this really says when your collective bargaining agreement is over, then you have the right to go in and have a negotiation about what should be the package. And these packages are very, very, I would say, gold tinged. And that's why the other thing that's making this actionable is the Cadillac tax. I don't think most people realize that cities and states are subject to Obamacare. They have to provide employee health, and they're also subject to the Cadillac tax. The Cadillac tax is a 40% excise tax above a certain number, and the number is about $27,000, $500 for families. Now, if you look around the world, look around the United States, there are only two classes of people that have these very expensive plans. One of them are CEOs, and people don't care about them. But the other is public employees. I've dealt with a number of unions and tried to convince them to, for instance, pick up what's called the Gold Plan under Massachusetts Connector. It's not good enough. These people have great plans, not good plans, great plans. Sometimes no co-insurance, sometimes no deductibles, free eye care, free this care, free that care. But this is going to be 2018. That's why they're so costly. And New York City alone is estimating that in 2023, if they keep going, the Cadillac tax will cost them over $500 million. So that's a number that's going to really, the combination of ability to at the end of the collective bargaining agreement to renegotiate, and second of all, everyone has an interest in avoiding this excise tax. It's just so huge. So I think those will have the salutary effect. As you might expect, there are already various movements in Congress to repeal the Cadillac tax. I'm hopeful that that won't happen, or if it is delayed or something like that, people start to put real conditions on it, like the employees have to contribute, like you have to have deductibles or co-insurance. So I think that's a big thing. Now, I want to go back to Jeremy's point here is, how do you make these numbers real to people? And I think that's the most difficult problem. I think, I'm sure lots of people in the audience know that Bob Merton said to me, of course the assumptions are wrong in most of these pension plans, discount wrong. We've known that for years. The question is, how has it become an actionable item? And I think what we need to do is to start to translate, first of all, aggregate these numbers, aggregate pensions, retiree, all these unfunded liabilities. And second of all, start to translate them into terms that really bite for the local resident. And one of those terms is property taxes. So Newton here, I gave an example where it had a override, but most of the money in the override went to pay for retiree health care. I don't think there's anyone in Newton who knows that. In fact, every time I tell anyone from Newton that their unfunded retiree health care liability is $550 million, they almost fall off their chair. I mean, that's one hell of a number for a town of, what, 80,000 people. I mean, that's a serious number. This isn't, you know, New Jersey. This is supposedly a well-run city. So that's one thing you can do. And I think the other thing to do is, and I think Jeremy and I took, it's the crowd out function. You can raise taxes. You can, if you don't renegotiate things, you're going to wind up raising taxes, or you're going to have to cut other services. So again, what we did here with help of the mass taxpayers is say, how many teachers, fewer teachers are you going to get because of this? And then people start to respond. So so it's the two-step. Let's aggregate these numbers and project them out 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And then let's say, how much is going to be left for police, for schools? That's, you know, how much more are you going to have to pay in taxes? Those are the sorts of things that I think will grab people. We are used to dealing with these big numbers, billions, you know, trillions, but I think it's too abstract for people. So I'll just end by going through a few obvious things you could change. We changed the eligibility standard. Massachusetts is particularly bad, saying in 10 years, you serve in a public employee is 10 years, even part-time, and then you're eligible for retiree health care for the rest of your life, which seems very, I mean, if you're rewarding somebody, you ought to be rewarding somebody who's been there for 25 or 30 years. Second of all, let's have some real sharing of premiums. Let's have some deductibles and co-payments. Let's have some limits to COLAs. I mean, these are all so obvious. They're just minimal cost control, but they're not in a lot of these contracts. So the conclusions are pretty simple. In most cities and most states, though not all, we have this sort of very quietly building unfunded liability. People talking a lot about pension funds. They're not talking much about retiree health care. But this thing is going to blow up. It's going to blow up because A, the numbers are getting so big, and B, somebody starts looking at a 40% excise tax of Cadillac, that will catch their attention. So I think the good news is that these are changeable. The Supreme Court has told us this, and unlike, you know, all these states that say you can't change anything in the pension, I don't think I've ever seen a state that says you cannot change retiree health care in the Constitution. I mean, it may exist, but it's very rare to be there. So I think that if we can educate people as to this what the total liability is in these things, while we will have, I mean, Illinois has shown us how difficult it is to change even the slightest benefit for somebody who's already in the system. This is an area where we could do something, and if we can get the right numbers in the aggregate, and when we can drive home to people what this is going to mean in terms of their property tax in their schools, I believe that we can do something, and that, you know, people will, when you come to the end of the collective bargaining agreement, people will say, hey, we just can't keep going like this. And what's the ultimate trade-off? Remember, almost all of these retiree health care benefits are unfunded. In Massachusetts, the average funding is like 1%. It's nothing. So what do these people have? If we go to Stockton's bankruptcy, the answer is nothing. They're unsecured creditors in a very large bankruptcy. They got nothing. So I think part of this is an agreement to say we will figure out a reasonable package, and then we will actually fund it so that 10 years from now you won't have nothing if something happens, that you'll have a funded liability. So I think that's the nature of the trade-off, and I'll stop there. I don't know, Debbie, whether you want to take questions now or you want to wait until everybody.
I was thinking I was going to let everyone speak, and then
Sure.
You can respond to each other.
Sure.
And open it up. So thank you very much. Next we have Tom Reid.
Thank you. And I came in late. I saw some fairly impressive technical arithmetic in this morning's presentations. And Sunghwan asked me, he said, are you going to be doing a technical presentation? And the answer is definitively no. I'm going to talk about the Canadian system. The only statistic I'm focused on right now, I'll tell you, is the Blue Jays' magic number of 14, and I know that might offend a few Boston Red Sox or Yankees fans. Any Yankee fans in the room? I think I heard a few New York accents. Well, we can chat after, but in any event, I don't know how much you think about Canada to the extent you think about Canada at all. You might think about Canada for hockey, but you probably don't think about Canada as a hotbed for pension reform. And maybe much as I would like it to go away, the pension reform issue just has legs. And it started about 8 or 9 years ago. And it just continues to be front page news. And it's a pretty remarkable phenomenon. And so I'll talk about that in just a second. But maybe what I'll start with is just a little bit of backdrop. And so the Canadian pension system is probably a little lagging. So we're a slow and late adopter to the DC trend. And so if you look at the numbers, there's a couple of reasons for that. Part of it is that there's a very high penetration of government employment in Canada, and that tends to be highly unionized. We also have a much higher level of unionization in Canada than the United States. I think it's about 30%, just under 30%. I think in the US it's about half that level of unionization, and unions tend to bring defined benefit plans. So defined benefit has really persisted. It's hung on, and it's still reasonably healthy. There are pockets of big issues. The federal government defined benefit plan is one where, frankly, the accounting would not measure up to any standard that you would have referred to at lunch. So, but I think this stat also, I would say, misses a few other employer-sponsored plans that are actually pretty substantial. We have things like deferred profit sharing plans and group registered retirement savings plans that also help fund retirement, and they're not included in these stats. But by and large, this gives you the overall theme. So let me just talk about what we do have in Canada. And so we talk about the 3 pillars. You will ask 3 Canadians in the pension industry, and they'll name 3. They'll list the pillars 3 different ways. So, but I'll just say that we have sort of the government-funded through regular government revenues, general government revenues. We have the old age security and guaranteed income supplement. And these are means tested. So at certain levels of income, so the guaranteed income supplement above $44,000 starts to get clawed back. The old age security above $73,000 of income starts to get clawed back. It's funded from general revenues. And then we have something that Canadians, I'll say, are generally quite proud of, and it's the Canada Pension Plan. And it has current assets of somewhere around $260 billion Canadian. Liability is about 3 times that. And if you're wondering why we're proud of it, it's because we've actually taken some action to address the issue. So the current funding level is addressing the intergenerational challenge, or at least trying to. So the cost of my pension in the CPP is about 6%. I'm actually paying about 10%, well, between my employer and me. So the extra 4% is going to fund, I guess, my father's Canada Pension Plan payments, which I've told him not to spend. I'm actually one of 11 children, so I'm not going to inherit much anyway. So but it is a formula that has sustainability for the next 75 to 100 years, according to the chief actuary in Canada, notwithstanding the comments that we heard about the actuarial profession at lunch. So, and the investment arm, by the way, is run independently by a not third party, but it's an arm's length organization, the CPP Investment Board, and I think it's actually quite well respected around the world. And then the third pillar is tax-assisted savings plans, and these are employer-sponsored plans, individual savings, home equity, and probably something very similar to what you would see here in the United States. So, with all that, how are we doing? How do we do in terms of taking care of Canadians in retirement? And I would say it's okay to pretty good. So on the left, you would see the poverty rate of citizens, senior citizens over age 65, and it's come down dramatically. And since we took measures about 40 years ago, in particular, to strengthen the old age security and guaranteed income supplement, the poverty rate has come down from close to 30% to 7.2%. So that's not bad. There's probably work to be done, but I think that that's a reasonable achievement. And then on the right, you would see how sustainable is this? And I can't tell you the scoring system that went into this. This is done by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Well, it says CSIS. CSIS is actually the Canadian Securities Intelligence Service, which is a very different organization. But this study really measures, is this going to be around for the long term? So you look at Australia does very well on sustainability because it's all employer funded, right, with the superannuation program. But it hasn't really conquered senior poverty yet. And I think we're striking a bit of a balance here in Canada. And I think overall it seems to be working reasonably well. And Canada also, to the extent that old age security and guaranteed income supplement are funded from general revenues, Canada's in a reasonably good fiscal position. There's an election on, so the government declared that there was a surplus of $2 billion last month, and the timing of that is propitious, I think, because the government is not doing that well in the polls. But the Canadian budget has been more or less balanced over the last decade and a half. We ran deficits in the aftermath of the financial crisis, to fund infrastructure, generate jobs, but by and large, it's in pretty good shape. So that's why we get, I think, the good marks in terms of sustainability. So with this apparent success, why all the fuss? Why all this pension reform talk? And it's just been constant. And I think there's a number of things that kind of some misinformation. And I think the first thing that governments put forward was that Canadians are unprepared for retirement. And there are tons of studies. McKinsey did a pretty large landmark study about a year and a half ago that would refute the view that there's a retirement savings crisis in Canada. This study was done for the ministers of finance in Canada and of all the provinces in the federal government. And you can see the stat. You can read it on your own. The second impression is that fees are too high in private saving vehicles. And the answer is yes and no. So in retail, fees are very high. Canada has probably the highest retail fees in the world. For a Canadian equity fund, you would be paying somewhere between 2.25 and 2.5% all in. And yet for that same Canadian equity fund in the business I'm involved with, if you have, for an average plan with, say, 1,000 members, you'd be paying 40 basis points all in, including all record keeping, education services, web, call center, all the things that we do. So that's a pretty strong value proposition relatively. In fact, there was a study done in 2009 that compared our fees in our DC pension environment to the rest of the world. In Canada came out, our fees were lower than the United States. And I might wish that they were higher, but Canada's pension system is about 1/20th the size. The DC pension system is 1/20th the size of the US. And so we're maybe punching a bit above our weight class. It's an extraordinarily competitive environment. And we hear from our US counterparts about how tight the competitive environment is. In Canada, it's remarkable, and that's driven fees down. And for investors and people saving for retirement, that's been a pretty good thing. The other issue that governments would say is that individuals are bad investors. And most individuals don't see themselves as investors, but I think I won't say the problem has gone away, but we've taken care of a lot of that with some smart defaults around target date funds, which, there's lots of academic debate about the merits of target date funds, but by and large, I think they do better than people trying to wing it on their own. And frankly, the inertia inherent in a defined contribution plan works as well. In the middle of the financial crisis, we saw very little movement of money out of active investment management into cash. At the time, about a $40 billion book of business, it was less than $100 million moved. So that tells me that the actual structure, the model itself, serves reasonably well to avoid some of the bad investment behavior that you might observe in the retail marketplace. And then the last one is about scale, and I think probably we have not achieved scale. Back to that first slide, we're still relatively small. The whole industry is probably just under $200 billion in Canada, and versus close to $4 billion or more in the United States now. I don't know the latest stats. But I don't think scale is actually getting in the way of low cost. So I don't know that that's a real issue. So what is government trying to do? And this is just a selection from among the many solutions. But obviously, one of them was to enhance financial literacy. And our former CEO actually chaired a committee that went across Canada to figure out how we could do a better job on financial literacy. I would say they've taken a good first step, which is to appoint a financial literacy czar in Canada. But I would also say that it has yet to show a lot of traction, and that's a long-term play. You're not going to improve financial literacy overnight. You're trying to embed some things in education curriculums and other places where people can avail themselves of it. And then there's been talk about enhancements to the Canada Pension Plan, and this is where it gets tricky because, again, you want to avoid exacerbating the intergenerational transfer. So. And then the third, which I think is actually quite interesting, and this is kind of a made in Canada but borrowed from other jurisdictions solution, and it's pooled registered pension plans. And this actually was an idea that we put forward from the company I work at. We originally called it the Canuck Saver because in New Zealand it was called the Kiwi Saver. So we figured we would mock off that a bit. And when the government came out with it, they called it the pooled registered pension plan. And it was driven by the federal government, but many provincial governments have actually gone about adopting this legislation. And I should explain, I think for private pension plans, is it one regulator in the United States? I asked this question of a luncheon colleague, but in Canada we have 14. So we're 1/10 the size of the United States, and we have 14 times the number of regulators. So if you're ever complaining about your pension regulator, just think of your neighbors to the north in terms of what we have to deal with, because they are not the same and they don't behave the same. But the pooled registered pension plan, so let me just tell you what it is. It's really targeting the pockets of undersaving in the Canadian pension savings landscape. And really it's study after study has shown that it's middle-income Canadians who don't have access to a workplace plan that are most vulnerable to undersaving. And so low-income Canadians, between Guaranteed Income Supplement, Old Age Security, and Canada Pension Plan, will be actually quite well taken care of in relative terms to avoid a drop in their standard of living in retirement. And it's really, I'll say, people between $50,000 and $125,000 of income. And I think I haven't found it easy to generate sympathy for above $125,000 from a policy perspective. Nobody's really going to turn their attention to that. So this is what pooled registered pension plan is aimed at, and the idea is fairly simple. It's a plan that takes the responsibility out of the employer's hands and puts it in the hands of an accredited financial institution. And the financial institution would serve the role as administrator and plan sponsor. The employer, the small employer who doesn't have an HR infrastructure and sophistication around investments, they don't want to pick investments. They don't want fiduciary obligation. So that all resides in the financial institution. And the best example of this is in the province of Quebec, where they've made it mandatory for any employer with more than 5 employees. And by 2019, all employers over 5 employees will be mandated to make this plan available. Employees that are automatically enrolled, they can opt out. The Smart Default Investment Fund is a target date fund. And in Quebec, the first adaptation date is Jan 1, 2017. And so we'll see it ramp up. There's already been quite a bit of activity on that front because it is currently available. But it will ramp up dramatically in the run-up to the deadline of Jan 1, 2017. So that's pooled registered pension plans. And then I live in the province of Ontario, where Ontario is putting forward a plan for what is called the ORPP, so the alphabet soup of pensions in Canada and retirement savings in Canada gets expanded. But the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan is intended to replace 15% of income up to $90,000 of income. And it's on top of your entitlement to Canada Pension Plan. It's an active debate right now. The government has a majority, so they can put this legislation through and drive on without being interrupted. But there are a lot of problems with it. And the first, of course, is cost. They don't know the cost of it yet. And when it was announced and they were pressed on that point by the media, they were asked what the cost was going to be, and they said they don't know the cost. That was the premier answering. And then the finance minister was asked, have you done a cost-benefit analysis? And he said, of course we've done a cost-benefit analysis. And then somebody pointed out and said, how can you do a cost-benefit analysis if you don't know the cost? So it is controversial. The Canada Pension Plan, it is something that is very well run, but it's not cheap. It's about 1.3 or 1.4% all in. And you could argue that they're going far afield outside of Canada to generate investment returns, and it's more expensive to do that. But this Ontario plan will lack the scale and will be a lot more expensive. They've also said, and sorry, we okay for time? Okay. All right, and then the other issue with it is, and this is a more serious one for lower income Canadians, is that at low levels of income, the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan will generate a clawback of guaranteed income supplement and old age security. So, you know, when you tinker with what is a very well-balanced system overall, and a system that seems to get good marks in international assessments of these things, you can generate some unintended consequences. More income from the Ontario plan means less income from the federal OAS and GIS, et cetera. And I think that's something that needs to be worked out before they move down the path on this plan. So I think in the interest of time, you can read that on your own. That's just my theory about how we should be doing this. I guess what it doesn't say is that if it's anchored in a set of principles, it won't be subject to political motivation. And then I think I will pass it back to Sunghwan. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So our next speaker is Sunghwan Shin.
Hi, is it working now?
Do you have a microphone?
I'm going to briefly talk about the challenges for public pension retirement system about Korea. So I'll give you some overview of the public pension system in Korea. And I have only 5 slides, so it will be very quick. The left-hand side bottom graph, that is the long-term profile of Korean pension fund. We have mandatory national pension fund. And the number stands for the billion USD. So, of course, the base currency is in Korean won, but for this presentation purpose, I converted that into USD. And at the end of 2000, at the mid of 2015, the fund size is about 436 billion USD. And it will increase up to 2.1 trillion by 2043. And it will start to draw down to 0 by 2060. So quite scary. So what's going on there? First, the mandatory national pension system started in 1988, so it's a relatively young system. So until 2035 or 6, there are more people who pay contributions than the number of people who get the benefits. And also, the benefit, when it was designed in 1988, the interest rate in Korea was higher than 10%. So benefit formula was designed very, very lenient. Of course, for last 3 decades, the parameters have been changed, adjusted, but still the formula is very lenient. It is a defined benefit plan, so there is a formula. And how the benefits are funded, two sources. The first one is a generational transfer. It's like a pay-as-you-go. And the second source is a fund. So if there is any leftover from the contributions to the benefit, if there is any leftovers, the leftovers go to the fund. If it's not sufficient, then the needed amount is drawn from the fund. And also, low interest rate environment. The fund does not grow as was initially expected. And most importantly, Korea has been experiencing dramatic demographic change. If I give you an idea about the change, demographic change, in 1965, the birth rate in Korea was 6. And after 10 years, in 1975, the birth rate dropped to 3. After 10 years, in 1985, the birth rate dropped to 1.5. Right now, the birth rate is 1.2, 1.3, the lowest among OECD countries. So I was born in 1963, so I belong to baby boomers. So I'm still working. That's not. That's why the pension fund does not have any problem yet. But once we started to get benefits, we will face a serious problem. And most people in the pension circle know that. But obviously, politicians, they have very high present bias preference. So they don't want to raise this problem on the table. Anyway, so that is why the long-term profile of the pension fund size goes up for next 30 years and dramatically goes down to zero. And what happens in 2060 when the fund is completely depleted? Then the system is automatically converted to pay as you go because there is no fund. So all the money has to come from generational transfer and the required contribution rate. Right now, the contribution rate is 9%, half and half, employee, employer. But if no action is made until 2060, and if the fund is completely drawn down to zero, then required contribution rate will be 24% of income, which I think is not an implementable number. And to give you an idea about the size of the fund relative to our economy, the right-hand side graph, it is the fund size relative to GDP, Korean GDP. So right now it is about 30%, and it goes up to 50% by 2043, then goes to zero. So you can, I guess, you can immediately fear that there are a lot of problems because 30%, 40% of our GDP money is managed by one entity, which creates lots of problems in our financial market. And also, if you're an asset manager, Korean National Pension Fund is a good place to go to because they have every year, they have tons of fresh money coming in for next 20, 25 years. For the purpose of comparison, I was asked to include some comparisons among Japan and China, other Asian countries. But if I go into details of the pension system itself, it is very complicated. So I just show you the fund size of these three countries' public pensions. So the tallest bar is, of course, the Japanese GPIF. The size is already more than 1 trillion. And the second tallest bar, that stands for Korea's National Pension Fund. And the third one is Chinese one. And the reason why Chinese fund size is not bigger than Korean or Japanese is because, again, they are very young plans, so young system. So the speed that the fund size will grow in China will be a lot faster than us, and I think than Japanese. This is asset management aspect. So I'm just going to briefly touch upon that. I compare Korea's NPS, National Pension System, to GPIF, CalPERS, CPPIB, ABP, most well-known pensions globally. And the CPPIB and ABP, they have separate asset management entity, whereas NPS, GPIF, CalPERS, the asset management function belong to the whole umbrella of the pension system itself. Of course, asset management team wants to be separated always, but not sure if that will be done in the future. And in terms of which assets they are investing, I think GPIF is heavily investing on bonds. And in case of Korea, we invest more on stocks, but again, a very large portion in bonds. And CPPIB, ABP, they invest more in alternative investments, and CalPERS more on stocks. So maybe that's why the number of staffs of CPPIB and ABP is a lot more than MPS, GPIF, CalPERS, because alternative investments require a lot more the manpower. So among many challenges, I show you two main challenges. One is very common. The other is very unique. So the first challenge, which is common, is the long-term sustainability. So we know that right now this is a Ponzi scheme. We know that. And we have to do something. And what can we do? As Professor Merton mentioned in the morning, whether we pay more, actually we save more, cut the benefit, gamble more, take more investment risk, or work longer. But the bottom line is that we have to do something. We have to come up with a combination of these alternatives. And we have to show the long-term soft landing plan to the people. And what I did in my study, actually I did not include my study in this presentation, was that I define a steady state. So steady state, you can define steady state in various ways, but I define it as normalized exercise stays the same. So normalized exercise divided by total income, or next is payment, or whatever. But I took it as exercise divided by total income of participants. And I define it a steady state if that normalized exercise stays the same. And if we actually, under the actuarial projections about future birth rate and so forth, if we plan to achieve the steady state within 70 years because in Korea, the actuarial projections about national pension system, the time span is 70%, but it doesn't have to be 70%. I think 70% is too much, it gives too much burden to the participants. And to reach the steady state, what are the combinations that can achieve that steady state? And in case of CPPIB, their objective was 70, if I understand them correctly, 70 years, at the end of 70 years, they want fund size to be at least 2 times of next year's payment. But that one, then what? Then after that, then what do they do? So, but the point is, actually, the one criticism is that after 60 years, 70 years, we don't even know that the world exists. So what's the point of making 70-year, 100-year plan? But the point is that we try to put some discipline on the system. So we try to create a blueprint of soft landing and show it to the public and legislate it if necessary. And periodically, the mechanism of adjustment should be included, because if they want to take more risk, the realized returns may be quite different. After 50 years, the birth rate may be quite different from what we originally thought. So as long as there is some adjustment mechanism, and as long as it shows that after 100 years, the system will be soft landed, then I think that is much better. Right now, no action at all, actually. So no politicians wants to put that agenda on the table, because that creates too much noise in the country. No, actually one more.
Oh, sorry.
The other problem is a very unique one. We call it a problem of a whale in a small pond. The fund is too big for our domestic economy. And right now, they invest 20% of assets in domestic stock, almost 20% in domestic stock market, 30% in domestic bond market, and some alternative, and 20% overseas. And already, they are the number one or number two largest shareholders of the major Korean companies. So it creates lots of problems. And the worst part is that the money is going to continue to come in. So they have to find somewhere to invest. So right now, 20% in domestic stock market, can they keep that proportion going forward? Probably not. Can they keep the composition of 50% fixed income in domestic fixed income market? Can they maintain that? Probably not. Then what can they do? Of course, they can invest abroad, of course. But liability is in Korean won. So if they have too much holdings, too much holding on asset side of foreign assets, either they have to hedge. In that case, that will create a lot of borrowings domestically as well, because anyone who provides hedging will cover their bag and create the foreign borrowing. Or they have leave the position unhedged. That will create a huge currency mismatch risk. So the question is, how do they find places to invest? So they cannot just increase foreign investment. They cannot keep the same proportion of domestic equity investment. They cannot keep the same proportion of domestic fixed income investment. What do? So that's why I am, and actually my institute is now trying to find a way for them to invest in Korean residential housing market. So Korean residential housing market, the size is, in terms of USD, almost 3 trillion, which is about 2.5 times bigger than Korean domestic stock market, and about 2 times bigger than Korean domestic fixed income market. But housing market is very illiquid, and also very heterogeneous. The nature products are very heterogeneous. But still, I think they gotta find a way to invest in real sector, real residential housing in Korea. Then I think they will make our flow of money in domestic market a little bit more virtuous, I think. So this is it. Thank you very much.
Well, now we'd like to open it up. I don't know, you wanted to first comment?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think they're great presentations. I was saying, listening to Tom, we have a similar problem in the U.S. Somewhere, people compute it, somewhere in the 70, 75 million of American workers have no retirement plan at work, period. Now, of course, they can go to an IRA, but this is where you get the whole problem of inertia and all this stuff. They don't. So there's a bill that's proposed by both the Heritage Foundation and Brookings called the Automatic IRA, and I think it has, last time I looked at it, 70 Senate sponsors. And it basically says if you don't have a retirement plan at work and you're above, I forget, 10 employees, you have to connect to some financial institution. They actually have a little tax credit there for you to reimburse you for the cost of connecting, and you don't have to contribute, and there's, like in your plan, an opt-out. But what's interesting is there's been debate about what the default option should be, and whether you should go in the federal service, whether you should allow individuals, whether you should just use index funds. So that's where we've been hung up. But I just handed Tom an article from a few days ago. Is, to me, surprisingly, we have 3 states now that have not surprisingly, I guess so much of California, but Oregon and Illinois, which have now decided that they're going to require this for their small employers, essentially to connect to a pool and then give people an opt-out, and then there'd be a default option. Be interesting for the tax mavens in the room to figure out exactly, I guess they're going to try to piggyback on the federal tax code since I don't know what their status is under the state. So I think it's interesting that the provinces have actually come up with a much better solution than we have, and I think we're going to struggle with this. And the Korean situation, I've done a little work of this, so you have we had a similar situation in Canada, which had a 20% limit. You had a similar situation that was in Australia, New Zealand, Norway, these small countries that wind up with lots of money. Foreign content limit, which was lifted, which was abolished. Did the same thing in Chile. I mean, the problem is when there's a government institution that winds up owning 7, 8, 10% of a publicly traded company, the politicization of that money gets to be very high. And you have a quote-unquote activist hedge fund, and it's just, so I wouldn't want to be there when that came about. I think your idea of a housing market is interesting, but I guess it depends a lot on how you structure it. We're experts on now how not to do a housing securitization market. So you might ask some of our experts on how not to do it, since we're pretty good at that. We know all the ins and outs of how not to do it. And the whole question will be how standardization is good, liquidity is good, how you can avoid guaranteeing, and how you can avoid over-investing, and how you get the people who originate these mortgages to actually care about the mortgages rather than just lay them off right away. So I commend I think you're right. You can't keep investing in the local stock market. It will kill you politically. But on the other hand, I don't know, when you say the housing market, I guess, I get the heebie-jeebies because we know what that leads to. And once you get the developers and the construction unions and all these people together, your ability to change it is very low. It's an unholy alliance, and we pretty much have it here. I'll stop there.
Great. So unless either of you want to say anything, I'll open it up to the floor. Yes, Steve.
Fascinating discussion.
We can hear you, Steve. Yeah.
Great, yeah, fascinating discussion. And I just wanted to share, Tom, I don't know if you were there or whatever. Somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, I got an invitation to go to the Canadian Embassy in D.C. And it was wonderful because they had the guy who was the lead person on the private investment board for the CPP private equities investment operation, and said, this is so wonderful, because he described this is going to be actively managed. It is actively managed. And I said, I can just imagine us having that in the United States, having a federal fund which is going to be actively managed in the markets, not so much. But then I said to him, wow, this is great. So how big is this fund going to get? Where are you going to invest it? He said, well, we realized very quickly that the Canadian market wasn't nearly big enough to absorb what we wanted to invest. We're going to be able to invest, I think the number is something like maybe 10%, and the rest is going to have to pretty much go south of the border to invest in U.S. securities. So then, of course, I asked the question back. I said, so what if the U.S. tried to do the same thing? And we have a larger population. We'd have larger investments we'd want to make. If our markets were not big enough to absorb all that we would want to invest, who would be the next dog up the rung that we would be going and investing with? And I think the moral of the story that we came to was there are some things you really cannot fully advanced fund for. And when you think about it in the United States, if we were to fully advanced fund just our little Social Security system, which in the long run would be expecting to have a cost not of 24% of payroll, which is about where Germany is, but maybe at most 2/3 that level. If we were to invest that right now, we'd have to be invested somewhere on the order of $25 to $30 trillion. Now, where are we going to invest $25 to $30 trillion for the Social Security system? And what if on top of that we decided, Medicare, it would be a great idea to advance fund Medicare, another, $10 or $20 trillion, maybe more than that there. Where do you invest that kind of money? So the bottom line really is, I think, for plans like this, the investment really is in the workforce of the future. The workforce of the future will be those from which you will be able to draw the money from their productive capacity. And this is the real challenge. And Sunghwan, I'm sorry to say, because you and I both know that our friends in Japan are now saying that they think they're back up about 1.3 or so, and they think they're going to be having a higher total fertility rate in the future, which is the whole story about being able to sort of finance in the long run. So I hope that you all, and Canada, you're what, 1.6, 1.7 total fertility rate? We're about 2.0. Yay, U.S.
Because of immigration.
Well, when the immigration
way.
helps, immigration helps on top of that, yeah. But
No,
what
but
we're,
because of the people who immigrated the last generation, I mean, that's where all
that helps,
the
no
birth
question,
rate
yeah.
is.
But we're still in relatively good shape. So really, the investment in the future is the next batch of taxpayers, because even if you do advance fund and have a large fund, when you want to draw on that fund, or if you have a large investment in the housing stock with a birth rate of only 1.25, what is the market for that housing going to be with that low a birth rate in the future? It might not be the best investment. I mean, as I'm sure Bob will tell you, what happened in the U.S., everybody in this room knows, when we started having the baby boom start to get beyond the age of buying the principal primary residence, what happens to housing prices? It's all supply and demand.
Other questions, comments? Oh, Jonathan? Oh, Peter.
Yeah, I was surprised at how little concern there is for just what the investment product is relative to the risks of the payments that you need to make. And so absent longevity risk and currency mismatch, it's very little. And so the pool of investments that you're really thinking about doing are as close to risk-free as you can, given demographic projections. And a significant share of equities and the like just is exposing to a set of risks that aren't matched on the liability side. It's potentially slightly higher rate of return, but states of the world where you don't have enough money, which are the bad states. If you're invested domestically, it's exactly the states where the economy is going down. Now, the flip side of that is you've got to think about the liabilities, and I mentioned longevity risk. There's also potentially indexation to average wages, which means, again, domestic economy risk isn't so bad, but global risks really could be a big problem. So I guess I just flag that, and I think of, in linking back to the lunch talk, it's not necessarily even the amount of dollars that you have at the moment relative to the dollar present discounted value of liabilities correctly done. It's how much risk are you taking with the dollars you even have today? And the concern we see at the state and local level is that there's gambling for resurrection, and that looked like a great play for the last few years. It looked like terribly in 2009, and it may look terrible again. So our problem could be dramatically more in the U.S. If we have just another shock to the stock market.
But well, how much investment risk to take certainly is a matter of choice from participants, because the right question should be, would you be willing to accept the contribution rate of, say, 15%? Right now it's now 9%, without taking any more investment risk. Or would you be willing to take 13% contribution rate and take more risk and shoot for higher investment return? So lower investment return will make it sure that the participants will have to pay more contribution. So that is the right question to me.
The question is, another question, Jonathan, is whether there is a role here for the international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, now the new China sponsor, to create some investment vehicles that are diversified and can serve as, to some degree, as a pension funding. I'm involved with a subsidiary of the World Bank where we've set up a series of funds to co-invest with the IFC private equity, and they're geared to these sorts of things. But I think that there's nothing perfect, but that might be a reasonable role to some degree for these institutions.